When I first started giving this lecture a few years ago, one thing you should know is that for the most part we don't pick the titles of our lectures. So I was assigned the title Ethical Assumptions of Economics, or Economics and Ethical Assumptions. My first reaction was, well, economics doesn't have any ethical assumptions. So I figured I should probably just get up and say that and sit down. But then I figured that they probably wanted me to say something more than that. So, I followed a general principle, which is, if you find yourself contractually obligated to do something impossible, then do the next nearest thing. So, since I can't actually talk about the ethical assumptions of economics, I can talk about the issue of the ethical implications of economics, or whether economics might have ethical implications. And so, I'm going to interpret assumptions as though it meant implications. Now, you often hear Austrian economics described as embracing a subjective view of value, or as being a version of value subjectivism. You also see that sometimes it's described as value-free, or to use the German expression, that it is wertfrei, or you sometimes see references to Wertfreiheit, or value freedom, as characterizing Austrian economics. Value freedom doesn't mean being devoid of value, nor does it mean some kind of especially valuable kind of freedom, or some especially freedom-oriented kind of value. But the idea is that to adopt a value-free or a subjective value view of economics is to do economics without bringing in, value judgments. Of course, we talk about values in the sense that we talk about the values of the people who are acting. So that's why it seems like a contradiction to say that it involves subjective value and to say that it's value-free, because you might think, well, if it's got subjective value in it, it's got some kind of value in it, so how can it be value-free? But the idea is that it's value-free in the sense that in doing economics, you're not supposed to be putting forward your own values. It's a subjective approach to value in the sense that you interpret people's actions in terms of their values rather than putting forward values of your own. And so then the question is, well, if Austrian economics is committed to value freedom or value subjectivism, does that have ethical implications? Does this mean that you couldn't hold an objective ethical theory, for example, if you're, if you hold Austrian economics? Yeah, well, spoiler alert, the answer I'm going to say is no, but it could be a controversial answer, since Mises seems to have thought yes. Mises seems to have thought there was some kind of connection between the kind of value subjectivism or value freedom that he thought economics should involve, and you might worry about that should in that sentence just then, and his view that you couldn't have such a thing as an objective ethics. So I'm going to talk about some of that. First, I just want to make a comment about a point that is sometimes made. Sometimes it's made in criticism of Austrian economics. Sometimes it's made by Austrian economists themselves. It's not always clear exactly what the moral of it's supposed to be, but it's sometimes pointed out that a lot of the terms that are used in economics are, at least according to a certain interpretation of them, maybe not entirely value-free. Think of terms like welfare, or, not welfare in the sense of the government program welfare, but welfare in the sense of people seeking their welfare. Or terms like property. You might think, well, to refer to welfare is to refer to what makes people better off. That is what really makes them better off, whatever that is, which might or might not be the same thing as what they think makes them better off. Or, if you talk about property, you might think, well, nothing counts as your property unless you have it justly. If I steal something, then it may be in my possession, but it's not my property. And so you might think, well, if economics talks about property, then it's thereby committed to talking about, property rights, or what the right theory of property is. Now, there may be a sense in which this is right, and there's some places where Rothbard makes a similar point and says, look, you've got all these economists talking blithely about property, but in order for them to really settle what they're talking about, they need some kind of theory of property rights. On the other hand, there's a sense in which it's not quite true, which is that insofar as you're simply trying to explain people's behavior, it's not clear that you need a theory of just property rights. In other words, if you want to explain, here I have some legal title to something and I'm selling it to you. Well, in order to understand the exchange and my willingness to give this up in exchange for you giving me this money, we don't actually have to know whether I have just title to what I'm selling you or whether you have just title to the money you're giving me. Just in terms of understanding the exchange, it's going to work the same way whether the title's just or not. However, it's possible to push a little bit farther on this kind of point and try to develop it into an ethical point. And there's some arguments we find attributed to the Greek philosopher Socrates. For example, there are a couple of dialogues, the Hipparchus and the Eryxias. It's not clear who they're by. They're traditionally attributed to Plato, but it's sometimes doubted whether they're by Plato, although they seem to be from roughly the same era or maybe a little later. And you find similar arguments, although in less detail, in Plato and in some other Socratic writers, such as Xenophon. Anyway, in these dialogues, Socrates gives the following argument. He says, he asks the person he's talking to, how do you define profit? And the person says, getting back more in exchange for what you put in. So if if I give up a certain amount and I get back more than I gave up, then that I made a profit. As an economic analysis that's fairly crude, it doesn't distinguish between, let's say, profit and interest and so forth. But leave that worry aside. Let's think about profit in some broad sense, where profit and interest would both count as profit. Well, Socrates says, all right, so suppose, and I'll translate his example into our money, suppose I give you a $10 bill and you give me three $1 bills in exchange. Well, I gave you one thing and I got back three things, so have I made a profit? And of course the answer is obviously not. And the point that Socrates is trying to press is that it's not, when you talk about getting back more in exchange for what you gave up, it's not more in terms of physical quantity. Because in terms of just mass physical quantity, there's more of that in $3 bills than there is in one $10 bill. Rather, it's the value of them. So it's giving up something of lesser value to you in exchange for something of greater value to you. That's what's meant by, what he's calling profit, which again we're using in this broad sense. A broad sense where obviously you wouldn't engage in any kind of exchange unless you expected to make a profit in that sense. Well, now Socrates wants to get an ethical moral out of this, because he wants to say that nothing counts as a genuine profit unless it really is more valuable. And since in value he wants to include ethical value, then if I attempt to make a profit but I do so immorally, then what I'm doing is really, is getting me something of less value. And so therefore, it's impossible to profit immorally, according to Socrates. Now, Mises would object to this by saying, look, all you need to do to define profit is to define it in terms of subjective value. That is what the person personally happens to value. And so, obviously, I don't count as a profit unless I get what I personally value more in exchange for what I personally value less. But Mises would deny Socrates' further inference that I don't count as profiting unless what I get is of objective value. He says, no, all that matters is what you subjectively value. Now, part of Socrates' disagreement with Mises here would be that Socrates thinks that when you value something, you value it in the belief that it's good. And if you're wrong about its being good, then then you haven't really gotten what you wanted. And so you haven't really profited. But of course Mises doesn't think there is such a thing as being objectively good. So this dispute doesn't really settle things one way or the other until we start describing where their positions come from. But now I want to make a distinction between what I'm calling explanatory value subjectivism and normative value subjectivism. And does everyone have the handout? Because I see. All right. I just didn't see any handouts out there. I have to make sure people have them. Okay. So, explanatory value subjectivism is when you explain people's actions by appealing to their values rather than yours. But normative value subjectivism is the view that, to say something like all values are equally valid, or there's no such thing as one value being more true or correct than another. And so the first thing to point out is that explanatory value subjectivism doesn't necessarily imply normative value subjectivism. So by analogy, think of it this way. When you want to explain someone's actions, not only do you appeal to their values rather than their own, you also appeal to their beliefs rather than your own. So if you see someone walking out onto a bridge that you know is broken and is likely to collapse under them, but they don't, then in explaining their action, you don't appeal to your belief about the bridge. You appeal to their belief about the bridge, namely that it's safe. And likewise, if you see someone choosing, let's say something to eat that you find disgusting, maybe they like it, and so you appeal to their value and explain rather than their own. If they're going for what was the example? The sour cream, sauerkraut, and salmon smoothie. Maybe somebody likes that, and so they keep scooping that stuff up, and so in order to explain their actions, you have to appeal to their values rather than their own, just as you have to appeal to their beliefs rather than your own. But of course, the fact that in explaining their actions, you have to appeal to their beliefs rather than your own, doesn't necessarily show that all beliefs are equally true. The bridge might really be broken. In order to explain their action, you have to explain their action in terms of their belief that the bridge is not broken. But that doesn't mean that your belief that the bridge is broken and their belief that the bridge is not broken are just somehow, equally valid beliefs. Maybe, the bridge really is broken, or it isn't, one or the other. So likewise, if you have to explain, someone's action in terms of their values, again, that's consistent with the possibility that there really is an objective value. But just that in explaining their action, you explain, their, in terms of their mistaken views about what's valuable, rather than the actual truth. That's why I think you could make the case that you can buy explanatory value subjectivism, namely explaining people's actions in terms of their own values, without thereby committing yourself to normative value subjectivism, the view that all values are on an equal footing, or none of them are objective. However, Mises does think that, or does seem to think that from explanatory value subjectivism, from that you get some kind of reason for accepting normative value subjectivism too, and I'll say in a little bit why I think he thinks that. Okay, so economists, nevertheless, are often invited to give advice. Now, if economics itself doesn't involve any values, any objective values, how could an economist give advice? Well, there are three possibilities, or three possible ways it might happen. First is the way that Mises stresses, which is, Mises thinks that economics can't give you any advice about your ends, your goals. Your ends, your goals just are these subjective things you happen to have. But what it can do is it can tell you whether you've chosen practical or impractical means to your ends. So you've got a certain goal, and you are doing something in order to achieve that goal. So let's say, your goal is to produce, economic stability, and so the means you've chosen to that goal is, to, let's say, just to pick an example at random, to double the money supply overnight, because you think that will make the economy more stable. Well, Mises would say that economics can't tell you whether you ought to be trying to make the economy more stable or not. Maybe you're into stability, maybe you're into instability, whatever you're into. But if in fact you do desire, as your goal, a stable economy, then economics can tell you that this means you've chosen of doubling the money supply is not in fact going to achieve that goal. And so economics can give criticism and advice in the sense that given certain goals, it can offer information about what means will and what means will not promote them. Now, Mises thought that since most people, most of the time, favor things like peace and prosperity and stable cooperation, then economics can give sort of, broad-based advice. In the same way that, for example, there's a sense in which medicine is value-free, and that medicine, can tell you what causes health and what causes sickness. But you might think that the practice of medicine all by itself doesn't favor one over the other. After all, you could be you could be using your medical knowledge in order to, produce germ warfare to make people sick or something like that, just as you could be using your economic knowledge in order to figure out how to wreck the economy if that's your goal. But most people, most of the time, favor health rather than sickness, and so therefore, a doctor can say, speaking as a doctor out of their medical expertise, they can say, here's my advice, you should do such and such, but they're giving that advice assuming that most of the people they're talking to, are pro-health. But of course, strictly speaking, there might be some people who are anti-health. In that case, really being a doctor doesn't give you an expertise about whether health is a good thing or not. It's just that most people assume that it is. Socrates used to say that the doctor is an expert about what will kill you or cure you, but a doctor is not an expert on whether you're better off dead or alive. According to Socrates, the philosopher is the expert on that. The philosopher is the expert on whether your life is worth living or not. And Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living. So, if you're not examining your life, then Socrates might prescribe hemlock for you. Or at least you'd be no worse off with hemlock than without it, as long as you're not living a philosophical life. Well, likewise then, Mises would say that economics can't tell us whether prosperity and peace and cooperation and stuff like that are good things. Now, he wouldn't say that philosophy can tell us that. He would probably think that nothing could tell us that. However, given that most people most of the time want those things, then economics can give us advice about how to get it. Now, Rothbard makes the point, and he devotes the last chapter, well, it's chapter 6, I forget if it's the last or the second to last, chapter of Power and Market, to the following idea, which is that economics or praxeology can, in a sense, criticize ends without presupposing values. Now, one way you can criticize an end is to simply say the end embodies a mistaken value. The end is valuing something as good when, in fact, it's bad. Rothbard doesn't think that economics can criticize ends that way. But one way he thinks you can criticize an end is by showing that it's impossible or incoherent. After all, it doesn't make any sense to aim at something, unless you think you can get it. It's part of aiming at something that you think there's a chance that you could achieve it. If something is actually impossible to achieve, then it doesn't make any sense to aim at it. And so this is another way in which you can criticize not just means, according to Rothbard, but ends too. They say economics can criticize ends by showing that those ends are incoherent. And so he has this chapter on anti-market ethics in Power and Market, where he goes through various goals that people have offered as sort of morally valuable goals that Rothbard considers anti-market goals. And he goes through and criticizes them, and the grounds on which he criticizes them is he thinks economic reasoning can show that these goals are impossible, or the goals somehow don't make sense. Now, Rothbard did think, unlike Mises, Rothbard thought an objective ethics was possible, and that you could go on and not just criticize certain goals, but you could actually positively try to show that certain goals were good, or that we were committed to thinking of certain goals as good. But he didn't think of that primarily as a job for economics. He thought that this was a job for ethics and went beyond that. And so when, after Power and Market, he went on to write The Ethics of Liberty, although there certainly are praxeological themes in The Ethics of Liberty, he didn't take The Ethics of Liberty to be primarily an economic argument for libertarian rights theory. He took it to be, he took himself to be going on to doing moral philosophy. But then there's a further question, which is, is it possible that in addition to criticizing ends, it might even be possible for praxeology to try and, support some ends or support some ethical principles? And one reason this is interesting to think about is that there's a way of thinking about what the ancient Greek philosophers were doing, people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and the Epicureans and the Stoics. When you look at the kind of defenses of their ethical theories that they try to give, they do things like analyzing actions and analyzing the structure of means and ends and so forth. And it looks as though they're trying to do something like deriving a positive ethics from praxeology. So it's worth considering whether there is that option out there. I'm not going to sort of give a full account of how such a thing might go, but I'll be saying some things along the way that are relevant. Now, there's a dispute between Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian school, and Ludwig von Mises on the nature of what Menger calls imaginary goods. And Menger says, look, there are cases where we value something, because we think it meets some need of ours, and we can be mistaken about that. Now, so far, Mises would agree. You can be mistaken. For example, you might think that something will quench your thirst because you think it's water, but it's actually something else. It doesn't quench your thirst. So you can be mistaken on whether a good will meet your need. But Menger goes farther and thinks you can be mistaken on whether one of your needs is a genuine need or not. Menger lists various things that he thinks are goods that are designed to meet spurious human needs. So things like good luck charms and so forth, and cosmetics he includes as one of these things, interestingly enough. Well, Mises thought that this was a terrible mistake for Menger to introduce this class of imaginary goods, and Mises argues that Menger should not have introduced it. Basically, he has two reasons for not liking this category of imaginary goods. One is that he thinks that there's the weaker and the stronger point he wants to make. The less extreme point he wants to make against Menger is, look, imaginary goods don't play any role in explaining things. There's no difference between the market for genuine useful tools and the market for good luck charms. If you want to explain that market, you just will explain in terms of people's actual preferences. And the fact that you happen to think that this preference is a preference that's based on a genuine human need, and that preference over there isn't, you might have that view, but Mises thinks it doesn't play any role in economics. From an economic standpoint, it's going to be exactly the same result. If people want, if people want more of these, if people's demand for good luck charms goes up, then you can make a prediction of what the price will do and so forth. Or if the supply of good luck charms, dries up, then it'll drive up the price and so on. You can analyze all these things about how these things work without assuming anything about whether they meet genuine needs or not. So that sort of Mises' first point is that economics doesn't need this category of imaginary goods. However, Mises wants to make a stronger point than just that. Not only does he think it's irrelevant to economics, he thinks it's not a legitimate category at all. Because he thinks there's no such thing as a difference between a genuine and a non-genuine human need. We just prefer whatever we prefer. And he thinks that, all ends are ultimately arbitrary. So, Mises thinks that the only mistakes we can make are mistakes about our means. You can't be mistaken about an end. You can't pick the wrong end, because there's no such thing as an end or a goal being right or wrong. Those are just given to us by our appetites, and that's the end of the story. Mises thinks that the only mistakes you can make is about the means to your ends. If you happen to have a certain goal, you can have false beliefs about what an efficient way of achieving it is, but you can't be right or wrong about your goals. Whereas Menger thought that you could be right or wrong. You could make mistakes about goals, not just about means. Well, one thing I want to point out here is that the distinction between mistakes about means and mistakes about ends is a little trickier than it looks once we distinguish between what are sometimes called instrumental versus constitutive means. Where an instrumental means is a means that is external to or not part of the end it's promoting. And a constitutive means is a means that's part of the end it's promoting. So, here, to take a following example. Suppose I have the goal of playing the Moonlight Sonata. That's my goal. So, first I want to start saving money to buy a piano. And so I start doing extra work in order to get more money. I start economizing on some of my expenditures and so forth in order to get enough money to buy a piano so that I can play the Moonlight Sonata. Well, clearly this stuff I'm doing, saving money, If you ask why am I doing that, am I doing it for its own sake? No, I'm doing it as a means to playing the Moonlight Sonata. Well, this is going to be an instrumental means, and not because the Moonlight Sonata is a piece of instrumental music, but because it's an instrument. It's merely a tool. It's not part of the saving money is not itself part of the goal. It's merely an instrument or a tool for achieving the goal. But now suppose I've saved my money, I've got the piano, and suppose that right now I'm actually playing the Moonlight Sonata. And at a particular point I play a particular chord. That one. Right then. And you ask me, why did I play that chord? Was playing that chord an end in itself? Well, no, not exactly. I played the chord because that chord comes at that point in the Moonlight Sonata. My goal is to play the Moonlight Sonata. In order to do it, I have to play that chord then. So I didn't just play that chord then because I just liked that chord. I just wanted to hear that chord all by itself. The chord by itself didn't do anything for me particularly. Maybe it's a pretty chord, but I wouldn't have played it then and there unless I was playing the whole Moonlight Sonata. So there's a sense in which playing that chord at that moment is still a means to the end of playing the Moonlight Sonata. But it's not the typical kind of means that you usually think about when you're thinking about sort of means-end reasoning. It doesn't fit into sort of the typical example people usually think of in economics. Usually people think of a means as, something that you do at time 1 in order to bring about some later result at time 2, causally. Whereas playing this chord isn't really something that, causally brings about some further result. Playing the chord then is just part of playing the Moonlight Sonata. And so playing that chord is a constitutive means. A means that is a constituent of or part of the end. One way you can tell the difference is to ask whether it would make sense to say that you wish you could have the goal without the means. In the case of instrumental means, it makes sense. Even if in fact you can't do it, at least it's not an incoherent wish to say, I wish I could play the Moonlight Sonata without having to save all this money. Or, I wish I could get to the 3rd floor without having to go up the stairs, and so forth. In the case of instrumental means, it always makes sense to say, I wish that I could achieve this goal without this means. Someone could bypass the means and get to the goal directly. But in the case of constitutive means, that tends not to make sense. It wouldn't make sense to say, gee, I wish I could play the Moonlight Sonata without playing all these notes. Because the Moonlight Sonata just is those notes in that order. So it doesn't make any sense to imagine a shortcut to the Moonlight Sonata when they get to the Moonlight Sonata without all these notes and chords and stuff. Well, why does this distinction matter? Well, we know we can be wrong about the instrumental means to our ends. We can believe that something is an instrumental means to an end and yet turn out to be wrong. But you might very well think you can also be wrong about constitutive means to your ends. You might think you have some sort of your vague, hazy notion of the goal, and you could be wrong about whether it's actually constitutive of it or not. For example, you might not realize that this particular chord is part of the Moonlight Sonata, and so you might not realize that you need to play that chord in order to play the Moonlight Sonata. So it looks like we can be mistaken not just about instrumental means to our ends, but constitutive means to our ends. Well, if we can be mistaken about the constitutive means to our ends, in other words, if we can be mistaken in specifying generic goals, then it looks as though at least a lot of what people have in mind when they talk about being wrong about ends might not be as incompatible with praxeology as you might have thought, because it might be that maybe when we talk about being wrong about ends, what we really mean is we're wrong about the constituents of our ends. We've got some sort of generic conception of our end, but we've made a mistake about how to fill it in. And if that's right, then maybe a lot of so-called ethical disputes about ends might turn out to be might turn out that they have a way of replying to Mises' criticism. Well, what does Mises say about ethics? Well, interestingly, Mises claims that value subjectivism supports something he calls utilitarianism. And you might think, first of all, this is a very odd thing for him to say, because you might think, look, utilitarianism is a positive ethical theory. It's a theory about which actions are objectively good, namely the ones that promote the objectively good end of human welfare. And so you might think that someone who denies there can be any objective ethical values couldn't really be a utilitarian. But Mises is not using the term utilitarian that way. He's not using the term utilitarian as the name of a moral theory according to which the objectively good end is human welfare and the objectively right action is to promote it. Instead, by utilitarianism, he simply means the view that people's goals are just given and that all you can do in the way of advice is simply tell them about how to achieve the means to their ends. So that's what he means by utilitarianism. And also, when you see Rothbard attacking utilitarianism, there are many contexts in which what Rothbard says doesn't make any sense until you realize that by utilitarianism he means this position that Mises calls utilitarianism. Now Rothbard also has criticisms of sort of the more standard ethical conception of utilitarianism. But in some cases when Rothbard is talking about utilitarianism, and if all you know about utilitarianism is what philosophers usually call utilitarianism, you're going to be baffled at what Rothbard's talking about until you realize by utilitarianism he means this Misesian view that that all there is to ethics, or all there is in the place of ethics, is the ability to give people advice about how to achieve the goals that they already have. Now, why does Mises think that if you're an explanatory value subjectivist, someone who thinks that that in order to explain the actions you always have to appeal to their subjective values, why does he think that this leads to normative value subjectivism in the sense where there is no such thing as ethical advice except in terms of telling people what the means, presumably the instrumental means to their ends? Well, here's a quote from Mises that I think helps to explain where he's coming from here. Here's what he says. All non-utilitarian systems of ethics look upon the moral law as something outside the nexus of means and ends. The moral code has no reference to human well-being and happiness, to expediency, and to the mundane striving after ends. It is heteronymous, that is, enjoyed upon man by an agency that does not depend on human ideas and does not bother about human concerns. So this is Mises' criticism of what he calls non-utilitarian systems of ethics. Now, there's sort of an ironic joke in here. He uses this term heteronymous, which is a term he borrows from Immanuel Kant. He uses it as the opposite of autonomous. And Immanuel Kant is sort of the ultimate example of a non-utilitarian system of ethics. And so Mises is calling Kant's system heteronymous. And the irony here is that Kant uses the term heteronymous to refer to the theories he rejects. Because Kant thinks that you're only being autonomous when you're following your own reason. When you're following the commands that come from reason alone. And Kant thinks that there are certain moral commandments that are built into the structure of human reason. And when you're following those, you're being autonomous. Whereas when you're following your inclinations, you're being heteronymous. Autonomous means giving a law to yourself. And heteronymous means following a law given to you by someone other than you. Hetero meaning other or different, and nomos meaning law. So basically, autonomous means to be self-governing, and heteronymous means to be governed by another. So Kant thought that when you're following your inclinations and desires, you're just being pushed around by your desires, you're being heteronymous. Which is only when you're following the moral duty that's built into human reason are you being autonomous. So Mises is sort of flipping these notions around, because Mises doesn't think that there are any moral duties built into the structure of human reason. So Mises thinks you're being autonomous when you're following your inclinations. And you're being heteronymous when you're going against your inclinations to follow some kind of duty that's being imposed on you. And Mises thinks that being heteronymous in this sense is ultimately impossible. That is, Mises thinks that we always necessarily, follow our inclinations. Meaning all action is the application of means to ends. And so therefore it's impossible to act except to act for the ends you have. And so the way he interprets what he calls heteronymous systems of ethics, that is, or non-utilitarian systems of ethics, is he sees these as ethical systems that demand of you that you pursue some end other than the ends you actually have. These things, people automatically always pursue whatever ends they have, and they apply the means that they believe will serve those ends. So, so when they, so as he sees it, any moral system that's not utilitarian, in his sense, that is, any moral system that gives you advice about what ends to pursue, as opposed to giving you advice about the means to your already existing ends. First of all, he thinks it's going to be sort of a piece of arrogance and effrontery to demand of you to pursue ends different from the ones you already have. But second, he thinks it's really demanding something impossible. We always necessarily pursue our ends. That's what action is to pursue ends you have. You can't pursue an end you don't have. And so therefore, he thinks that these ethical systems are systems that simply don't understand praxeology. And that's why he says they look upon the moral law as something outside the nexus of means and ends. And so he thinks both that it's demanding something impossible and that there's something unpalatable about what it's demanding. They're saying, why should you care about your petty human concerns? Just do what this moral authority says. What he thinks, in a way, it's almost a moral criticism of it by saying it's immoral to demand of people that they sacrifice their own happiness for the sake of this duty. Now, of course, strictly speaking, since Mises doesn't believe in any objective moral code, he can't think it's somehow objectively wrong to demand that people pursue this non-utilitarian system of ethics. But he seems to think that anyway, it's demanding something impossible, and it's something he at least has an aversion to. But of course, keep in mind that if you buy this distinction, and Mises always talks about ends, or seems to always talk about ends as means as though they're instrumental. If you think there could be such a thing as constitutive means, and therefore if you think it might be possible to give people advice about how to fill in the details of some vague, generic end they have, if you think that could be objective, then a lot of the things that Mises is going to reject, maybe he doesn't yet have grounds for rejecting. Now, there's something called ethical internalism, which is the view that you can't have a duty unless you've got some kind of motivational basis for the duty. And the basis behind this view is what's called ought implies can, which is it doesn't make any sense to say you ought to do something unless you can do it. It wouldn't make any sense for me to say, you have a moral duty to flap your arms and fly to the moon right now. It couldn't be a moral duty because it doesn't make sense to say that you ought to do something or that you can be blamed for not doing it unless it's something that's possible for you to do. So, if you ought, to do something and you can't do something unless it's one of your ends or goals, then it doesn't make any sense to say that you ought to do something that isn't, something you already have as an end. However, internalism comes in more than one flavor. There's some versions of internalism that say you can't have a duty unless, this duty corresponds to some already existing end you have. On the other hand, there are versions of internalism that say that once you recognize you have a duty, that somehow gives you a motivation. That too would be consistent with saying that you can't have a duty without a motivation. So there's disagreement with sort of what explains what. But at any rate, internalism isn't the same thing as value subjectivism. Because you might think that some ethical demands are perfectly objective. It's just that, you can't have them unless you happen to have certain motivations, but they might think that it's part of being a human being that you necessarily have certain kinds of motivations. So for example, someone like John Stuart Mill would say that it's part of being a human agent that you necessarily value pleasure. And therefore, you have a commitment to that goal. Or an Aristotelian would say it's part of being a human being that you necessarily have a desire to flourish as a human being. And then philosophy can help you fill in the details of what counts as that, but that everyone has that. There's a book, I guess it's about maybe 5 years old now, something like that, by Leland Yeager, called Ethics as Social Science, which you can see as defending an updated version of Mises's conception of utilitarianism. And Yeager accepts the view that all ultimate ends and goals are arbitrary. Jaeger says, well, this is a reason to be utilitarian. Because if you're a utilitarian, you only have to accept one goal, namely, maximizing human welfare. That's the one goal. Of course, it's arbitrary, as all of them are, but nevertheless, it's fairly uncontroversial. Most people like human welfare, not just their own, but other people's. They, like that, people should be better off. And so it's an uncontroversial goal, and it means you just have one point of arbitrariness in your system. You have this one arbitrary goal. His objection to non-utilitarian theories of ethics is that they have more than one arbitrary goal. Because although most ethical theories say that human welfare is a good thing, a lot of them stick in other things that are good things too. So, for example, suppose that I could make everyone on Earth slightly happier by torturing one person. There are billions of people on Earth, and so the slight increased happiness of each one, you might think would outweigh, forget about interpersonal comparisons of utility problems, but you might think that the slight increase of happiness of billions of people would outweigh the pain of this one person I torture. And so if I think that increasing total human welfare is a good thing, then that gives me a reason to torture this person. But let's say I'm a natural rights theorist, I also think that there's something else that's good, namely refraining from torturing people, even when torturing people would produce a greater good somewhere else. So that means I've got more than one moral commitment. I've got a moral commitment to human welfare, but also I've got this moral commitment to not torturing people. And probably, if I've got a moral commitment to not torturing people, I've probably got some other moral commitments too. And so I've got a whole bunch of different ones. And Jaeger's objection is, well, then since all these element goals are arbitrary, according to Jaeger, you've got a bunch of different arbitrary principles in your system. Any ethical system ultimately has to be arbitrary, he thinks, because the ends are arbitrary. But as long as you've got arbitrariness in your system, you want to have as little as possible. And so he thinks that the best system would be a utilitarian system where you have just one arbitrary value, human welfare, as opposed to having, like a natural rights system where you value not only human welfare, but not torturing people and not lying and not stealing and all these different things. Yeah. Well, I guess, I don't know why, I don't know why that would be any less arbitrary than the other one. Well, for that matter, I'm not sure why having multiple points of arbitrariness in your system really makes it any more arbitrary than having one, because you could just regard you could just have this one long big conjunctive sentence, saying, I value X, Y, and Z, and you can throw in stuff about how they're related too. It's just one long arbitrary thing, but it's not clear, if your whole system depends on arbitrariness, as he thinks it does, it's not clear why you're any better off, having sort of a minimalist arbitrary thing. Usually the point of minimizing something is minimizing arbitrariness in your system is so you could get rid of it entirely. But he doesn't want to do that. So I'm not sure that argument works. But also, I don't think that it's obvious that these things are arbitrary. And there's a big methodological dispute here. There's something that, philosophers usually call it reflective equilibrium, but that's a description of a hypothetical end state. As a good Austrian, we should probably talk about reflective equilibration. There's a difference between sort of processes that pursue equilibrium and actually getting there. But the notion of reflective equilibration in philosophy is the idea of weighing different commitments against each other, and for relative when you find they conflict, weigh them against each other for relative plausibility and keep the ones you're more committed to and get rid of the ones you're less committed to. Jaeger is a big enemy of this system, of this way of proceeding in ethics, because he thinks that it just appeals to intuitions. But it's not just in ethics we do this. I think we do this in empirical science too. For example, suppose that I get some stuff that I believe is water, and I do what I believe to be boiling it, and I test the temperature with what I believe to be a working thermometer, and I get the result that it's boiling at 90 degrees centigrade. Well, then I know that one of my beliefs is wrong. Either I was wrong in my belief that water doesn't boil until 100 degrees centigrade, or I was wrong in my belief that this stuff was water, or I was wrong in my belief that I was boiling it. It's bubbling, but of course water can bubble without boiling. air might be blowing into it from somewhere. Or I could be wrong in thinking that I know how to read the thermometer properly. Or I could be wrong in thinking it's a working thermometer. So I know I have to reject something. But, it's a standard principle in philosophy of science that our beliefs approach the tribunal of the senses, in a block and not individually. It's very difficult to do a scientific experiment that falsifies some one particular proposition. Usually it falsifies a big conjunction. One of these things must be wrong. But it doesn't tell you which, but often, it's obvious enough that some things are going to be more plausible than others. It's more in this example I just gave, it's more plausible that I've made a mistake than that somehow I've discovered that water really boils at 90 degrees and everyone else has been wrong. So reflective equilibration isn't necessarily a sloppy way of doing, it may not be sort of the ultimate explanation, but it's not necessarily a sloppy way of doing an inquiry. And so we think that once something has survived the process of reflective equilibration, it no longer counts as sheerly arbitrary, perhaps. Now, there's a long tradition which starts with Socrates and that runs through some of the other Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, and so on, and then on through the scholastics, people like Aquinas. A certain way of thinking about means and analysis. According to this approach, which is sometimes called eudaimonism, from the Greek word eudaimonia, which is often translated as happiness, but that's somewhat misleading, because at least when we use the term happiness nowadays, we usually think of sort of a subjective mental state of a good feeling, and this is really a broader notion. It makes something like your life going well as a whole, which presumably includes your feeling good. If you feel lousy all the time, your life isn't going well as a whole. But there's more to your life going well as a whole, it's usually thought, than just how you feel. It's, the objective way that you're existing in the world. And the idea is that each person has an ultimate goal. Namely, something like this, this overall flourishing. That's our ultimate goal, and then everything else is a means to it, but a lot of it's going to be constitutive means, sort of components of it, rather than just sort of instrumental means to bringing it about. And that a lot of our mistakes, whether you want to call them mistakes about means or mistakes about ends, are mistakes about the constituents of this goal. Now, why did they think that we had an ultimate goal? And why did they think that there's some commonality among our ultimate goals as opposed to each person having their own? Well, here's why they thought that it didn't make sense to think that we just have a bunch of individual goals with no ultimate goal into which they all fit. Imagine the opposite. Imagine that I just have a bunch of individual goals, but they don't fit together into any overall life scheme. They're just a bunch of things that I value. Here's what would be problematic about that, according to this Greek tradition. So let's simplify it by just saying I have two goals. I have two goals, and there's no sort of overarching goal into which they fit. So let's say my two goals are fame and ice cream. Those are the only two things I care about in life. Well, if I'm lucky, there'll be lots of cases where I can satisfy both desires. For example, entering an ice cream eating contest might be something that would win me fame if I won, but also get me ice cream. So, lots of cases where these goals are going to be compatible. But there will be cases where they aren't. There are cases where the thing that would get me the most ice cream right now and the thing that would get me the most fame right now might be different. And so I have to weigh them against each other. Okay, I value fame and I value ice cream, but there'd be cases where I'm going to have to do some kind of trade-off and say, well, do I want more fame or more ice cream? Do I want one more unit of fame or one more unit of ice cream, in this, for this next choice? Well, it seems as though I'm going to have to engage in some kind of decision-making like that. When I do that, when I'm trying to decide whether to go for another unit of fame or another unit of ice cream, what's my goal? Well, it doesn't seem as though my goal is fame, in that case. Because in that case, if my goal were fame, I wouldn't be trying to decide what to do, I'd just go for the fame. It doesn't seem as though my goal is the ice cream. It seems I've got some more complicated goal, like, getting, the best combination of the two I can, or the best weighted sum of the two, or something like that, or satisfying as much of my various goals as I can, but with some kind of weights as to which ones are more important. Anyway, there's some kind of description of something that's more than just fame and ice cream. I've got some kind of goal of fitting them together into an overall system. So that's why the Greeks tended to think that each person is committed to having some kind of overall system into which all their goals fit. Now, of course, if you ask John Stuart Mill about this, he'd say, well, sure, of course there is. What motivates us is pleasure. We've each got this psychological state that we're trying to get more of. Pleasure. And so when you try to decide between a particular unit of fame and a particular unit of ice cream, you're trying to decide how much pleasure each one would cause and which one would cause the most increase of pleasure right now. Some people, instead of talking about pleasure, will talk about sort of relief of distress or relief of uneasiness. In fact, Mises sometimes talks this way. He talks as though what motivates us is always to relieve our uneasiness. And sometimes he just seems to mean it in a purely formal sense. It just means, you try and, satisfy your desires. But other times where it sounds as though we've got this feeling of uneasiness and we're trying to get rid of it. But of course, strictly speaking, it's not the case that all action is motivated by, uneasiness about the way things are right now. Because sometimes you're not trying to act to change the way things are right now. You're trying to act to keep them from changing. You do something in order to keep things from getting worse. You try to keep things the way they are. In that case, you're not feeling an unease about the way things are. Maybe you're feeling an unease about the way things would be if you didn't act, but it's not clear that's the same thing. Well, anyway, there have been a lot of philosophers who think that we're always motivated by trying to produce some kind of subjective mental state. Yeah.
Well, about what you just said, because uneasiness, that kind of worry, and so confined to the future, present.
Yeah, but it might be cases where you're not really worried because you know that you can prevent the future bad thing. You know you can do it easily. You're doing it right now. It's like, why do I keep periodically inhaling? Because I know that if I didn't, I'd die. But I'm not really worried. Now, if I thought it might be difficult for me to get my next breath, then I'd start worrying. But so far, I'm not having any problem. Or take example, suppose someone's just walking down the street whistling. Why are they doing that? Well, I think that's kind of distress they're trying to get rid of. They're enjoying the whistling, and so they keep it going. Anyway, here's a reason for. Also, I'm reminded of a line of Wittgenstein's. He was responding to someone, maybe it was Russell, who had said that the goal of any action is to get rid of the feeling of deprivation you had it, and so that, for example, hunger was simply desire to get rid of your hunger, and so Wittgenstein said, suppose I'm hungry for an apple, and someone comes along and punches me in the stomach, and as a result I lose my appetite. Does that mean that a punch in the stomach was what I wanted? Because the object of desire is whatever makes the desire go away. Which also reminds me of this is a digression. Reminds me of a philosophy book I once read in which the person defined proof as anything that brings the process of questioning to an end. So I think I'll give you proof. There's a big, quick, swift baseball bat to the head will be excellent proof. Anyway, here's a reason for doubting that some psychological state like pleasure is always our ultimate goal. Suppose I buy life insurance. It doesn't seem as though buying life insurance is an end in itself. It seems like it's a means to some further end. So what's the further end it's a means to? Well, the natural way of thinking about it is, so here's my action of, I buy the insurance. It seems as though this is a means to the end of my loved one's doing well after I'm dead. Let's say my loved one's doing well. But if everything I desire is a means to some pleasure, well, it can't be that this in turn is the cause of some pleasure I'll feel, because I'm not going to be around to feel it. So it can't be a pleasure that results from this that I'm aiming at. So if you think all action is motivated by desire for pleasure, it's got to be some sort of pre-death pleasure, which means that buying insurance causes me pleasure now. Well, it might. Buying insurance might cause me to believe that my loved ones are going to do well after I'm dead, and that belief might cause me pleasure now. So far, so good. However, that implies, if everything we desire for the sake of pleasure, that implies I don't actually desire this at all. Because this doesn't cause me pleasure. This belief causes me pleasure. But this itself doesn't cause me any pleasure because it hasn't happened yet. And by the time it happens, I won't be around to enjoy it. So, this would imply you can only desire things that happen during your lifetime. Which means I don't really desire that my loved ones do well. I only desire to believe they will. And that means that if I'm offered a choice between a life insurance policy for $100 and for $50 a magic pill which will make me believe I've bought life insurance, I would choose the pill over the life insurance because all I want is the belief. But it doesn't seem obvious that we are motivated that way. And so that's a reason for doubting that everything we desire is for the sake of some sort of mental state we have in this life. Now, we're out of time, and I had more brilliant things to say, but I have a link at the bottom here to a previous version of the lecture where I must have spoken more quickly. And so you can go read that and see what I would have said about this other stuff. Yeah. Time for one question.
Yeah, I just had a question about the life insurance. You argue that at least in the period of time where you're about to buy the pill or the life insurance, you have a belief then. And if you buy the pill, you know in that period.
Yes, so you might need an extra pill to give you a dose of pleasure to outweigh the pain you felt during that brief 5-minute period.
Doesn't that contradict Mises' idea that all actions take place in time?
No, you can have this period. There's a period of distress between buying the pill and taking it. And so in order to overcome that distress, they might have to offer you another pill. In addition to the pill that will make you buy life insurance, another pill that will give you this enormous burst of pleasure, which will be greater than the, no doubt intense, but still very brief period of suffering that you get when... Okay, it's time to eat.